Hey tea heads, this is Don from Mayleaf. Today I want to talk to you about what determines the price of tea available for you to buy. I'm often asked, sometimes with incredulity, why a particular tea costs so much, especially when compared with other teas that you find in your supermarket. And I can understand where this instinctive reaction comes from. Many of us think of tea as an everyday commodity, and we're used to paying pennies or fractions of pennies per gram. So the jump from this to the prices of true pinnacle tea can seem extreme. Today, let's dive into this in greater detail so that I hope that you can end up visualizing the various factors which are affecting these tea prices. Before we do that, I want to state very clearly that I think that even the highest tier teas are remarkably affordable compared with other specialty foods such as wine. For example, a really special tea, and I'm talking about really special tea, will cost about $1 to $2 per gram, and you'll probably use around 7 grams for a proper session, which will brew you around 1 to 2 liters of tea, which can be enjoyed over the entire day, sometimes over multiple days. So even the most luxurious session will cost you around $10 to $15 for the equivalent volume of about 2 bottles of wine. I know it's not a perfect comparison, but imagine trying to buy a luxury, super luxury bottle of wine, the most expensive out there, for less than $5 to $7 retail. It's never going to happen. There are, of course, many much lower priced teas which are delicious, and most of the pinnacle teas in our catalogue will be half of that price, if not more, costing around $3 to $4 per session. But what determines this price of tea? Well, let's split this up into 3 areas: costs, supply, and demand. And by far the most important factor to determine the price of your tea is the cost that it takes to bring the tea leaf from the mountains to your cup. Now, many of you may think, hey, it's just a tea leaf. You pick it, you dry it, and you send it to the shops. It should be cheap. Well, I'm here to obliterate that myth by giving you an overview of the work that goes into providing you with these brews. Please bear in mind that what I'm about to say is by no means comprehensive, and there are plenty of extra steps that I'm going to be intentionally missing out to simplify things. So the biggest cost in tea is in the form of labor. The tea plant will grow as it has done for millennia, but the work that goes into the journey of those leaves from the soil to the cup is astounding. The cost for producing tea can always be made cheaper by using mechanized systems or chemicals. This is why the majority of commodity tea will involve, or is more likely to involve, chemical pesticides, chemical fertilizers, and mechanized processing. The more that the work is done by hand and using natural techniques without the use of machines or chemicals, the more expensive the tea will be to make, and in the majority of cases will be much higher quality. So let's begin with the land, which needs to be managed. Often forgotten about, the land is obviously fundamental. In pinnacle tea, these are not just sort of plots next to good transportation systems. They're usually sort of epic forests and steep mountain terrain with limited roads that take hours to trek to and from every single day. For example, one of the factors which makes Wuyi Zhengyan tea so pricey is that the tea growing in those UNESCO heritage sites are only accessible through long and arduous hikes into the craggy rocks. And this is the same for many other pinnacle tea growing areas. The land is often managed over generations, tending to the whole ecosystem, enhancing irrigation, planting, and tending not just the tea bushes, but other trees as well, such as important shade-giving trees. Involves pruning, weed killing, controlling the bugs, enriching the soil, protecting the plants during harsh conditions. All of this land management happens throughout the year, and this is skilled and hard work, especially if you're not going to be using the chemicals that are available to you. but it is fundamental to ensure that the tea plants have the optimum conditions to make the most delicious tea. Then spring arrives and there is a mad frenzy of activity in the mountains as huge swathes of labour floods into the tea growing areas to begin picking. The window for picking tea is short and the areas to cover can be large, so it is essential that there are enough hands to pick. Too few and the leaves won't all be picked at the right time, which will affect quality, and the yield of the higher quality tea will be lower. Over recent years, the COVID lockdowns have dramatically impacted the amount of pickers which could travel into the tea mountains, which reduced yield, making everything much more expensive. And tea picking is a skilled job. They need to be fast, they need to be accurate and careful with their handling of the leaves. Lower quality pickers will cost less to hire, but the tea will invariably not be as good. This is the same with all subsequent processing of tea. The higher skilled worker will cost more to hire, and so the higher quality tea will inevitably cost more. Any outside workers, of which there are many that come from other provinces, will not just need to be paid, but they'll also need to be housed and fed. And this adds obviously extra costs to the production of tea for food, for shelter, and for supplies. The freshly picked leaves must move quickly after picking back down the mountains before they start to overly wilt and oxidize. And so it is essential that there's efficient transportation logistics set up for collecting and transporting the leaves down from the mountains. If the pickers are lucky, then there may be some roads or trails nearby where they can bring their baskets of leaves to be loaded onto vehicles. But oftentimes they have to carry their filled baskets over long hikes through steep terrain to the nearest pickup points. The leaves, the fresh leaves, will either go directly to a place where they can be processed, or for smaller farmers, they will go to what's called a fresh leaf market in the local villages. Here, the farmers will work to sell their leaves quickly to buyers who want to combine lots of batches to process the tea. It is often a very frantic and fascinating environment as buyers and sellers inspect leaves, negotiate prices, and make deals, all with the ever-present ticking of the clock as the leaves are continuously transforming. The leaves have to then be transported to the processing facilities, so more logistics need to be set up, and then they have to be weighed in by other staff and logged by management before they can begin the incredibly skilled and tiring work of processing the tea. The initial processing phase can take anywhere between 12 to 48 hours of continuous work. Most tea processing will begin with a withering phase. This sounds easy, you just leave the leaves to dry a little, right? But it's not so simple, just like everything in tea. The leaves must be evenly laid out, ideally outdoors to catch some of the sunlight, which definitely enhances the aromatics of the tea. They are sometimes turned every so often to sort of even the wither, and depending on the wither time, they need to be controlled under the sun, and if it starts to rain, then they need to be moved quickly indoors and laid out indoors in, again, controlled conditions. This all requires cost, it requires machinery, it requires, setting up the right environment. And depending on the tea type, workers may pile the leaves at particular depths for specific periods of time, and they may load the tea in and out of spinning bamboo cylinders, or they may handshake the leaves to encourage more transformation. The leaves may be rolled either by machine or individually by hand for very expensive teas like this Jinjun-mei, and then they may be piled for many hours in various controlled conditions to encourage more oxidation. Skilled tea experts will always be inspecting the leaves over the course of hours to confirm when the right level of aromatic development has been achieved, and then move on to the next phase of fixing. Bear in mind, I'm talking about pinnacle teas here. If you're talking about mechanized teas, it just goes along a conveyor belt with sort of set times and temperatures set in the hope that it's going to create a sort of even quality tea. But for Pinnacle tea, the majority of tea types will be inspected in this way, and then they'll be fired. And this is hard and hot work and very time consuming work, which requires experience, concentration, and skill. It is also non-stop work because every batch of leaves needs to be fired in a short window of time to prevent some leaves changing too much while waiting for the other leaves to be fired. So it's a frenzied activity that involves a lot of hard work, and often firing will therefore require multiple workers, all with their own costs. Many teas are fired multiple times at various temperatures for various purposes over many hours. If at any point, due to a lapse in concentration or a lack of skill, the leaves are allowed to scorch, then this can impair the entire batch of tea with a charred taste. There are many other skilled processes which may take place around now, such as rolling the leaves to improve flavor, or shaping the leaves into balls or other signature shapes. The tea will then be dried to finish this initial processing phase, and at the end of that drying phase, we have raw tea. Workers will then collect up and store the tea for the next phase, which is called the finishing phase of tea. This stage is even more time consuming for workers. The tea needs to be sorted and winnowed to remove broken or yellow leaves and undesirable stems. This is a very long process, and I'm in awe of the ability for workers to sit and sort leaves by hand for hours and hours on end. It is quite incredible. The tea then may be sent to another facility for fermentation if it's a ripe tea, with workers tending to the leaves for months in hot and wet warehouses. The tea also may be sent to roasters who will skillfully burn fruit wood charcoal for many hours in these hot rooms, always being careful that they don't impart the leaves with any whiff of smoke aroma. This roasting process may be repeated a few times with periods of weeks or months between roasts. The tea may be steamed and pressed into cakes, for example, pu'er or white tea, but other tea types as well. And then they have to be dried for a long time on racks before wrapping and labeling. From land managers to pickers, to all of the processors, to the shapers and sorters, to roasters, to fermenters, to people who press the cake and wrap the cakes, and all of the logistics that I haven't talked about in between. The number of people who provide their skill and hard work, and the number of hours that goes into the leaves on their journey to become finished tea is truly impressive, and they all come at a cost. But the journey for this finished tea has just actually begun. Now the tea has to be brought to market, and there are many possible business structures here and routes that can achieve this, but let me describe the more common ways that the tea makes it onto the retail shelves. First, the tea must be brought to the wholesale market. This may begin with a local area finished tea market, where wholesale buyers or local retail sellers will buy tea by eye. This is not a reliable way to sell or buy tea, in my opinion, but a skilled buyer may be able to snap up a great batch. Most often, however, the producers will send out samples to wholesale agents and occasionally to retail sellers who are committed to get involved at this stage. Let's call these retail sellers origin sourcing sellers. The wholesale agents and origin sourcing sellers will spend time traveling around, researching and building relationships with producers and with each other in order to be able to sample as many teas in a year and negotiate deals and buy teas during very short windows of opportunity when the tea hits the markets. And this in itself is a very time-consuming business, which takes many years to develop, and many connections that you make actually never lead to any purchases. So there's a lot of work, and there's a lot of wasted work, or work that doesn't lead to any tea being purchased. The cost of the time and expenses provided by these agents and sellers will all add to the cost of the tea, but their role is essential to select the right teas out there for their clients. Some agents and sellers are focused on cheaper price points and larger quantities. Others are looking to satisfy, let's call it the mid-specialty market, while others will try to pick up the most pinnacle teas of the season. All spectrums are covered for all potential markets, but the majority of the tea at this stage will be bought up by big agents and possibly blended on to sell to retailers, the retailers that don't want to get involved at this stage, that is. Next up, there are all of the costs to get the tea to the retailers. There are domestic and international transportation costs, customs fees, testing costs, and other paperwork formalities. And while these costs are a fraction of the cost of the tea leaf itself, they have increased immensely over recent years and require so much more work than ever before. Once the tea finally arrives to the retailer, then resources need to be allocated for quality control, for warehousing, for packaging, for labeling, for dispatch and for shipping, and all of the other myriad of overheads that are required to run a retail business. Retailers then need to spend time, money, and human resources just running the business and running the online shop and the offline shop if they have one, and of course marketing their teas and making sure that they have good customer services teams set up and a good after-sales service. So as you can see, there are plenty of costs which will contribute to the price of tea. I have really skimmed the surface and could unpack each one further, but then this video would be very, very long. All of these tea production and logistic costs must be recouped, and as labor costs go up around the world, then inevitably so will the cost of tea. This is especially apparent in truly specialist tea, with so many people being involved in the whole process from soil to cup. Other factors which come into play apart from cost are just the classical economics of supply and demand. So supply is never constant with tea. Every year produces different yields depending on many factors such as the weather of the season, the weather at the time of picking, human resources, the skill of the producers, the economics and other geopolitical factors. While there are millions of tons of tea produced every year, most pinnacle tea terroir has very limited supply due to low yields from higher quality cultivars and protected trees. Aged tea will naturally be even harder to find, and so this increases price based on supply limitations too. So that's supply. Let's move over to demand, and demand is also changeable. In recent years, the demand for specialty tea has increased substantially, and that has driven up prices, especially in China, where the average buyer is so much wealthier than they were, say, 10 or 20 years ago. The brand of the seller, or the fame of the terroir, or the reverence given to a particular tea variety like Jinjinmei, for example, will also increase demand, which in turn will bump up prices quite significantly. There is also a snob value factor which we can't ignore. This is when a higher priced tea leads to a higher perceived value of that tea and makes it more desirable, especially for gifting in China as a show of your wealth and generosity. This snob value can seriously inflate the price of more famous teas out there. And just in general, trends in tea create big movements in pricing. So aged whites, for example, were almost unheard of 10 years ago, but now command premium prices as demand increases, as more people discover the delights of aged whites. So retailers will base their pricing of tea on these three main factors: costs, supply, and demand. And while consumers may wonder about the profit margins of the retailer, it is worth remembering that everyone in the whole chain of production needs to recoup their costs and make money to make a living out of tea. The profit that a retailer makes is the last step in the profit journey and is regulated by their own models, expenses, and the quality of the tea experience that they offer to their clients. You know, you can find tea at almost any price point out there. The variation is massive. Inevitably, cheaper tea means that the costs to produce it were lower. Supply is higher and demand for the tea is easily satisfied. For the rarefied pinnacle teas out there, the costs to produce are high, supply is limited, and demand is voracious, often fueled by wealthy tea lovers at source. So, is the tea worth the money? Well, this can only be a personal question dependent on your love of fine tea and the amount of money in your wallet. I certainly think that the best way to spend your money is on tea whose price is mostly dependent on the cost of producing and bringing the tea to market, rather than the added snob value of trends and famous names, famous fields, varieties, etc. But oftentimes, an expensive tea which is hyped for its fame is also so magical to drink that you can do nothing but shrug and accept the markup so that you can indulge in its majesty. My role is to navigate through all of these waters for you and judge everything through blind tasting and by experience only, irrespective of name or price. It's only once I am unblinded and I have all of the information that I then have to decide if that experience is worth the money for our clients. I hope that this video has given you a better behind the scenes understanding of how a tea is priced, and hopefully an enhanced appreciation of the reasons why there are such vast differences in the cost of tea. Everyone has to find their own comfort level here when buying tea, but remember that if you have confidence in the discerning abilities of the seller, splurging on a luxury tea is almost always going to be a good decision. And as you enjoy that brew, just think of all of the effort that it took for you to take those precious sips. That's it, tea heads. Check out our other videos, taste our teas wherever you are in the world by browsing mayleaf.com, and come visit us if you're ever in London. Other than that, I'm Don from Mayleaf. Thank you for being a part of the revelation of true tea. Stay away from those tea bags. Keep drinking the good stuff and spread the word, because nobody deserves bad tea. Cheers.